The last day of death row inmate Paul Warner Powell. How a single letter put him back on death row. He thought he had beaten the system. At just 20 years old, Paul Warner Powell walked out of a courtroom with 3 life sentences, convinced that the worst was behind him. No execution, no death chamber, just years in prison. But arrogance can be its own undoing. From his cell, Powell picked up a pen and wrote a letter so cruel, so mocking, that it would change everything. He taunted the grieving family, mocked the prosecutor, and revealed chilling new details that prosecutors had never been able to prove. Powell believed he was untouchable, protected by the law. What he didn't realize was that his own words would drag him straight to Virginia's death row. Tonight we uncover how pride sealed Powell's fate and led him to one of the most shocking endings in Virginia's history. Stay with me and subscribe now for more haunting prison documentary stories. Dear friends, tonight we step into the chilling story of Paul Warner Powell, a man whose arrogance and hatred set him on a path that would ultimately lead to Virginia's death row. Unlike many who spend years fighting to avoid execution, Powell walked himself right into it with a pen, a letter, and his own words. His final 24 hours would be remembered not only for the electric chair he chose, but also for the irony that it was his pride, more than anything else, that delivered him there. Powell's journey began in Manassas, Virginia, in January of 1999. He was just 20 years old, a high school dropout with no steady direction, known for drinking, fighting, and loudly proclaiming his racist views. Those who knew him recalled that he spoke openly about being a white supremacist, often making threats against anyone in interracial relationships. When he learned that Christy Reed, a 16-year-old girl from his neighborhood and someone he once considered a friend, was dating a black boyfriend, his anger boiled over. To him, it wasn't just jealousy, it was rage fueled by prejudice. On the afternoon of January 29th, Powell confronted Christy in her family's home. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in Virginia's suburban history. Christy rejected him firmly, as she had before. Powell's twisted desire for control turned violent. He lashed out, stabbing her through the chest with a knife, killing her in moments, in a display of coldness that still shocks to this day. Powell didn't run or hide. Instead, he poured himself a glass of iced tea, lit a cigarette, and waited calmly for the next member of the household to return. That next person was Christy Reed, Stacy's younger sister. Just 14, she walked into the house unaware of the horror upstairs. Powell forced her into the basement and attacked her in an act of cruelty that nearly ended her life. He strangled her, stabbed her in the stomach, and slashed her throat, believing she would die. Powell left her on the floor and returned upstairs. But Christy's spirit was unbreakable. Despite severe wounds, she survived, and later she would become the key witness who stood in court to describe everything that happened. Their stepfather, Robert Culver, returned home minutes later and discovered Stacy's lifeless body, then rushed into the basement where he found Christy barely clinging to life. She was rushed to the hospital, underwent emergency surgery, and against all odds, survived. Doctors stitched dozens of wounds and closed gashes across her body, leaving scars that would never fade. Yet her determination to face Powell in the courtroom became a beacon of strength for her family and the community. When Powell was first tried in 2000, prosecutors pushed for capital punishment. But Virginia law required that Stacy's killing be tied to another felony, such as a completed sexual assault. The forensic evidence at that time could not fully prove that element. So Powell was convicted of first-degree murder. He received 3 life sentences, plus additional decades for other crimes. At that moment, he thought he had won. Sitting in prison at just 22, Powell boasted to anyone who would listen that the worst was behind him. No execution, no death chamber, just time to serve. But arrogance became his undoing. In 2001, Powell wrote a letter directly to the prosecutor and, shockingly, to the Reed family. The letter was cruel, mocking their grief. He bragged about his actions, taunted them with details, and most importantly, admitted to elements of the crime that had not been proven in the first trial. He confessed that he had pinned Stacy down, threatened her, and then stabbed her through the heart when she resisted. With those words, Powell handed prosecutors exactly what they needed to reopen the case. He believed that double jeopardy would protect him, that he could not be tried again for the same crime. But he was wrong. Because he had revealed new details, the state was able to indict him again, this time for capital murder. The second trial in 2003 was decisive. The jury heard not only Christy's courageous testimony and the forensic evidence, but also Powell's own incriminating letter. It was as if he had written his own death sentence. The result was a conviction for capital murder, and Powell was sentenced to die. He was transferred to Virginia's death row at Sussex Ward State Prison. For years, he continued to fight the sentence, appealing on grounds of double jeopardy and constitutional violations, but each appeal was struck down. In 2004, the Virginia Supreme Court upheld the conviction. In 2005, the United States Supreme Court declined to intervene. By then, the end was inevitable. What set Powell apart, even in death, was the method he chose. Under Virginia law, he was allowed to pick between lethal injection and the electric chair. Powell, always defiant, chose the chair, a relic of another era, a method rarely used in modern times. Some saw it as his final act of control, others as a way to leave behind a spectacle rather than quietly slipping away. As the date drew near, the Reed family prepared themselves for a moment they had waited over a decade to see. Powell remained mostly silent in those final days, but on the eve of his execution, he made an unexpected gesture. He called the family and said that what he had done was senseless and pointless, adding a simple, "I'm sorry." For the Reeds, those words came too late to heal, but they marked a rare crack in the wall of arrogance he had built around himself. On the night of March 19th, 2010, Powell was led into the execution chamber at Greensville Correctional Center. The room was stark, dominated by the oak electric chair that had been used for decades. He was strapped in by guards. The leather restraints tightened across his chest, arms, and legs. Witnesses, including members of the Reed family, sat behind the glass, waiting for the end. When asked for final words, Powell said nothing. He stared upward at the ceiling, expressionless, as if determined to leave this world without giving anyone the satisfaction of hearing from him again. At 9:09 in the evening, the warden gave the signal. A surge of electricity coursed through his body, causing it to jerk violently. The smell of scorched fabric filled the air. Minutes later, doctors checked for a pulse. There was none. At 9:18 in the evening, Powell was pronounced dead. The curtain fell on a case marked by cruelty, arrogance, and the resilience of a teenage girl who had survived against impossible odds. Christy Reed's testimony, her courage in facing the man who nearly killed her, was the thread that tied this case together from beginning to end. And Powell's own arrogance, the letter he should never have written, was the weapon that sealed his fate. Dear friends, Powell's silence in his final moments could not erase the voices of those he tried to silence years before. His story forces us to ask, can true justice ever be delayed? Or does arrogance always find its reckoning? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe to Deathwatch Diaries for more haunting prison documentary stories.